Coming back to our top story, the US-produced anti-Muslim film Innocence of Muslims has sparked outrage in Muslim communities. Several people have died in violent protests around the world since the attack on a US consulate in Libya on Tuesday. RFI's Laura Angela Bagneto spoke to a Muslim intellectual based in the United States who takes a closer look at the widespread violence.
Hello, I'd like to welcome to the program Muqtedar Khan, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. You are also the author of a book, Debating Moderate Islam, the Geopolitics of Islam and the West. Thank you so much for coming on our program today.
Thank you for having me.
So basically, there were anti-U.S. protests against a movie mocking Islam that swept across Africa on Friday and other countries. 6 people were killed around the world. Why is this happening now?
There are people who believe that even though the trailer for the movie was released sometime in June in English language, it was subsequently translated into Arabic and released and exposed to the media only recently. So while there are those who suspect that the initial protests in Egypt were timed on 9/11 to send an extra message, however, the subsequent protests that you have seen nearly everywhere else in Libya, Yemen, in Nigeria, Indonesia, Pakistan, even in India, all of these are essentially a reaction to the news spreading about the happenings in Libya and Benghazi, the attack on the U.S. Embassy and elsewhere. So most of the protests that you have seen in the last 2 or 3 days are those who are learning about the film after the Benghazi episode. There is nothing particular about the timing of subsequent things.
People watching this all over the world were asking each other if this is against that film that was made in the United States and the protests were about anti-U.S. sentiment, why would protesters in Khartoum in Sudan attack the German and British embassies?
Look at how some of American voices have responded to this. Like Mitt Romney, for example, has said that there is no need for the U.S. to apologize or express any kind of regret at what's happening. We should be proud of our values. And this whole issue that there is an incompatibility of values between Muslim respect for their prophet and this Western claim that the freedom of speech is paramount. And I think part of it could be a reaction to that, and they see that this is a Western thing. But it also depends on how the instigators of this is not exactly spontaneous. Most of these protests have been triggered after the Friday prayers. It depends on how the preacher at the mosque essentially motivated the people. If the preacher talked about the Danish cartoons, depends on how good the speaker was and how much he knew the history of Islamophobia and history of basically insulting Islamic symbols in the West. So depending on how these inciters did it. To give you an example, this morning when I got up, I read this story about a kid in England who is going to be sentenced to prison for posting something on his Facebook. He made a Facebook comment basically saying that after the death of 8 British soldiers in Afghanistan, he said that he wished that all British soldiers would have died or something like that. And so the British court finds that statement offensive and he's going to be punished. And so what happened to freedom of speech? Suddenly somebody is now going to go to jail for saying something on Facebook, and then when these movies, such as the movie that has just been made in California, The Innocence of Muslims, even the producer said that he did it to insult Islam and to provoke. So this whole discussion about values is becoming very unacceptable to Muslims and extremely angry because in many parts of Europe there are other things which are protected, such as you cannot deny the Holocaust, etc., but you can continue to insult the Prophet of Islam.
There have been a number of governments who've condemned the film, the German government, the U.S. government, but they also said that they had no part of it and that is not what the majority of Americans or Germans think. On the other side, if you see that there is a group of young men armed with sticks, that's not necessarily what all Muslims in Africa or in the Middle East believe as well.
What is clear that the people who are inciting this particular provocation are not representative of the U.S. or U.S. culture or U.S. values. When the Danish cartoons were published, most newspapers in Europe republished those cartoons in terms of solidarity for freedom of speech in Europe, etc. But nobody in the U.S. except one newspaper in Philadelphia, none of the newspapers in the U.S. printed those cartoons. People in the U.S., especially in authoritative positions, have been very, very, shall we say, careful and sensitive for quite a long time. When Terry Jones was trying to burn the Quran in Florida a couple of years ago, he received phone calls from the State Department, from Hillary Clinton, from Chief of the Military Staff. The President condemned it. Both the President and the Secretary of State have repeatedly condemned this movie and said this has nothing to do with the U.S. government. We find it despicable. Many leaders in America, religious leaders, political leaders, professors. So there has been a widespread condemnation of this film and recognizing what it is, that it's basically a film. It can't even be called a film. It's a really horrible, filthy, despicable thing. But there is no balance in the discourse coming out of the Muslim world. But then there are also things like in the U.S. now there are 25 states which are seeking to ban the Sharia. And for a Muslim, to me, for example, I fast in the month of Ramadan. If Sharia is banned in the state of Delaware, then will I be committing a felony and going to prison if I fasted in the month of Ramadan? So there is a very strong sense of anti-U.S. sentiment in the Arab world, premised on the notion that they are anti-Islam.
Dr. Muqtedar Khan, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. You're speaking from Newark, Delaware. Thank you so much for joining us today on the program.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.